Hello, friends. Deep within the ancient etymological origins of the word fathom lurks a powerful concept, the concept of embrace. To fathom someone originally meant to enfold them in your outstretched arms and clasp them close to the bosom of your heart. This basic and profound gesture of embrace evolved into the two complementary and contemporary notions underlying the word fathom. First, a unit of distance. A fathom is about 6 feet, the tip-to-tip length of both arms fully reached out as if to hug someone. This unit is still used nautically to describe the depth of the ocean in 6-foot increments. And secondly, there's a kind of a grasping and enfolding and getting your arms and therefore also your mind around something, grokking it, fathoming the gist of any position, argument, or perspective. So the evolving meaning of fathom is to embrace, to enfold, to understand, and to measure depth. What could be more appropriate for integrative consciousness? And that's why the Integral Stage is proud to partner with the supporter of this episode, Fathom.fm, a powerful and praiseworthy new podcast player that purports plausibly to be a promontory echo of the future of podcast hosting, which is probably worth checking out. Fathom is a new kind of podcast player now available in the Apple Store, which uses artificial intelligence to make leading-edge, emergent content streams available in a much more powerful way. Individuals can easily search for themes and concepts present within and across various conversations. It's pretty unique. Fans of the Integral Stage could use the link in the show notes or simply search for Fathom FM, where they can type a question and get answers from within the ever-expanding universe of the Integral Stage. And that's just one of the amazing things you could do. With Fathom, you can read transcripts and captions, navigate podcasts using chapters, flick through podcasts, listen to quotable moments, and much of the much moreness. Fathom's novel AI engine will help you discover other podcasts that discuss topics that match or echo the explorations that we service on the Integral Stage. Arguably, it's an essential tool in the kit and/or shed of any integral metamodern liminal webhead. That rhymed. And the more you listen to the podcasts and conversations you love, the better Fathom gets at recommending episodes from across the cosmos of living ideas, harvesting thousands of podcasts using neural networks that are fine-tuned to find you tasty memes in a hyperdimensional meaning space. It's AI-powered synchronicity, if that's a thing. Get your inner operating system upgraded and visit Fathom.fm. It's free and it will change the way you interact with podcasts, with the internet, maybe with information itself. That's Fathom.fm. Hello, everybody, and even if you don't have a body, I'm Layman Pascal, and this is the Integral Stage. And if your secret indulgences happen to include Bayesian logic or emergent neuromantic hive minds and transdisciplinary complexity, or perhaps the spiritual extension of the sciences through a crowdsourced, embodied, gamified teleological stance that may or may not participate in the awakening of the cosmos through sapient beings, then you'll probably at least tolerate the following casual hangout with author of Romance of Reality and friend of emergence communities, Bobby Azarian. Hi, Bobby.
Hey, Layman. How you doing?
Good. Bobby's a fun name to say. It's got a great colloquial conviviality to it.
Yeah, it's short for Bobak. My dad's actually Persian, so I'm not a Robert. I'm a Bobak. But yeah, Bobby's interesting. It feels a bit like outdated. It feels like a 50s name, like the quarterback on the high school football team. But yeah, I'm proud to be keeping the name alive.
Nice. All right, I got two bits of sort of housekeeping before we get started. The first one is, how is young Wittgenstein von Neumann Azarian doing? Because it can't be easy to start out with an IQ of 200.
Yep. Little Wittgenstein's great, and he's up to 215 now, and he's working on a theory of metacausal calculus.
Nice.
So I can't understand it. I'm too dumb to understand it, but he's going to present it to me when he can start speaking in full sentences. So pretty soon.
Fantastic. Secondly, we have an Integral Stage author series to promote people's work. So that's always an option, but today's more casual. But I did want to say, if there's anything you want to plug before we get started, that's great too. I know Road to Omega's ramping up community engagement with Substack and YouTube and some kind of crypto incentive program. So is there anything you want people to know about before we get started?
Yeah, that's on the way. So Road to Omega is my Substack that I'm working with friends right now. Most of the posts have just been further explorations into the concepts presented in my book, The Romance of Reality, which came out in the summer. And so that's for sale at Amazon. And yeah, so it's going to be more than that, though. So I'm going to start bringing the other people into it and doing a lot of interviews. So I have interviews lined up with scientists and philosophers, people like Howard Bloom, psychedelics and consciousness researcher Adam Safron, origins of life researcher Nick Lane, neuroscientist John Joe McFadden, a whole bunch of really interesting people. And soon, before the new year, I'll be making a new post that basically describes everything that we're going to be doing in the next year. And yeah, I want to get the community involved, because I think if you're trying to do something that creates change, you need to form a collective mind. No single individual can do it on its own. So the ideas, a lot of them are just sort of rough ideas that actually require feedback from the community to evolve into something, that can actually do something. So yeah, I'm excited about that, and go check it out and subscribe.
Just before we started recording, we were talking about how you didn't even know about metamodern community.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting thing because we use the word community like there's a community and there's a potential community, but really it's a kind of overlapping network of communities that everybody comes into through either their own vision or a vision they got into or a community they became part of, and they start to realize there's a number of adjacent, overlapping, resonant projects out there. Then you get the sense that there's this larger network of quasi communities. So yeah, there's no real question there. I'm curious how you feel like, you're coming in from an angle and then you're finding that there's these other spaces of people who are engaged in similar kinds of pursuits.
Yeah, it was really interesting to see. About halfway through writing the book, I was kind of seeing the big picture of the paradigm that was emerging from all the research I was doing and from all the different people I was interviewing. And it seemed like there were problems with this postmodern philosophy that kind of was influencing and is still influencing culture, but academia too. And I think there are a lot of things that are problematic about it. Just, the whole ideology seems to be kind of based on a critical stance, which is good. We need to be critical of, for example, science. We need to be critical of, any sort of like spiritual movement. We need to be critical of our political structures like capitalism, because criticizing things, as Karl Popper would say, that's sort of the method of natural selection. So things become optimized through feedback and criticism. But at the same time, if everything is based just on being critical of other theories, you're not really putting anything forth, and you're actually trying to bring down these bodies of knowledge that have been developed over time through the accumulation of knowledge. So we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I was like, so what comes after postmodernism? Like, what's postmodernism? And so there was this double post thing, and it seemed like metamodernism was the next evolution in this. And where postmodernism is skeptical of these grand narratives, metamodernism, at least my conception of it, is a kind of return to the grand narrative, maybe the ultimate grand narrative, this grand narrative of cosmic evolution that life is an essential part of. And that's, what my book is about, basically cosmic evolution, but really about life, because life is a part of this process. I'm not just talking about the emergence of planets and stars. This is the process involves life emerging, and then life becomes the driver of complexity growth. So this paradigm would say that life does have cosmic significance. But people had come to this idea in the past, people like Herbert Spencer, people like Teilhard de Chardin, and there was a lot of criticism of the theory for different reasons. a lot of it hadn't been explained mechanistically, so it seemed kind of mystical, like there was some teleological force that had to be pushing life in the direction of progress. I think we now know that's not true. You can have this inevitable increase in complexity and this tendency towards progress just through adaptation of organisms, but also adaptation of societies. And the other kind of problematic thing with that view was that ideology had been abused by people like the Nazis, which used this idea of a ladder of progress to argue that there was this sort of hierarchy in nature, and hierarchies are throughout nature, so that nature is hierarchical, but they used it to argue for some races being inferior over others, and for like social Darwinism and eugenics movements. So really after World War II, this sort of narrative became banned from academia. Like it was just kind of agreed upon that you weren't supposed to apply evolution outside of the biological domain because it would lead to these dangerous ideas. But I think now that we understand this process more, and we can see evolution occurring at every scale. I mean, any time you have a system, any scale systems exist at, you're going to have evolution, because it's just the development of a system through variation and selection. So we have this new view of evolution where we see that there is this tendency towards progress, but there's not so much of a ladder, there's more of a web. Everything's interconnected, so no race or no species is even inferior or superior. It's all part of an interconnected whole. But if you don't see this, you're completely lost. And then you're left with things like cultural relativism, where every sort of idea anyone has is equivalent, even ideas that, some cultures constantly have human rights violations. And so this is saying that there is objective truth, and we may never be able to reach that objective truth, but we get closer and closer to it through this process of testing our ideas. So yeah, that was kind of a lot, but yeah, I see metamodernism as the return to a grand narrative, and the return to the idea that we can get towards something like objective truth and reality. And it takes the ideas from postmodernism that were really important and advances, like the idea that many things are subjective or relative, but it says that we can look at things and understand that relativity and subjectiveness, but it can be part of this larger narrative that I think is required to give life a meaning and a purpose. Without that, we're just left with a sort of nihilistic worldview.
Yeah, I came into this stuff through like my own combination of esoteric spiritual practice and philosophy and science, and trying to make those all work together, and having certain experiences that made me feel like I had a tremendous opening in my mind for a while. And the only thing I wanted to put in there was something like postmodernism. I didn't know what that meant, but I was looking around for it, and I ended up with the integral community and the spiral dynamics people, because there weren't a lot of people putting forward these ideas. Yeah. I got involved there, and you start to find out, oh, right, there's a bunch of similar communities. But one of the things that's really deep in my mind from coming in from that direction is this notion of these developmental levels, where you draw some rough analogy between individual, like Piagetian stage development in individuals, and some kind of cultural phase development. And that's always an ambiguous concept, because like you're saying, it has a certain resemblance to the type of ranking that was used in various modernist genocidal attempts over the years. So the question is, like, how do we use it safely, right? If we say, okay, there's something like a level or something like a transition to seeing this web, to seeing this possibility of the reconciliation of these spirit-like possibilities of transdisciplinary science, that's terrific. But is there anything we can do in the way that we go about this to minimize the chances that it gets really misused socially by people who want to rank themselves as superior?
Yeah, I think what we have to do is every time we're explaining this thing, like let's say someone's explaining these levels of development and showing like depictions of this hierarchy, every time it's presented, unless you know that this, background understanding that we're talking about is understood by everybody in the audience, if that's not known, if there's any uncertainty about that, then we should almost always explain this, like this way of looking at things, this framing can easily be abused and distorted, and it has in the past, and we need to make sure that that doesn't happen. I saw the debate between Nora Bateson and Daniel, the half of Hansi Freinacht, and they were having this debate where Daniel was on the side of this sort of hierarchical model, and Nora was saying that it's dangerous, and her father, I think, was an advocate for that as well, and it's this Hegelian dialectic where you have two sides, and there's truth on both sides, and what emerges from that is this larger synthesis where you say, okay, there's a lot of truth to these ideas, but we need to be aware of these things. And I think when you do that, people like Nora should be happy. They should be like, okay, you satisfied my concerns. But if you just try to throw all of that out, for example, similar things like postmodernist attacks on evolutionary psychology, because maybe there were some bad ideas and biases in evolutionary psychology. You shouldn't get rid of all of evolutionary psychology. There's lots of important knowledge there, and just getting rid of that knowledge just sets us back so far. So we need to have this practice where we look at both sides and we understand there's knowledge to be gained from that, whether it's like a debate about like capitalism or communism or socialism, like those two things. I think the truth is always emerges from looking at both sides and understanding that both sides have reasons to criticize whatever they're criticizing. They're usually valid concerns. And as someone who is a science journalist, so besides all of this stuff about like evolutionary theory, I often write about politics, and those are my articles that actually get the most exposure. I'm always seeing this culture war between like the right and left, and it's almost like you have to join one side or the other, and then you're part of that tribe and you're at war with the other tribe. But what I've noticed is that both sides, the things that they're pissed off about, there's a reason for that. They're actually pretty valid concerns. So yeah, the integral community was something that I found out after I wrote my book as well. And they did have these ideas. I think a lot of them are taken from developmental psychology, of this hierarchy applied to like, how we can like live our lives and stuff. And I think that was really cool and kind of different than what I talk about in the book a lot, even though I do talk about that as well. A lot of it is focused on this hierarchy in nature, where nature's simplest components like atoms come together to make molecules, molecules come together to make cells, cells come together to make multicellular organisms, which come together to make societies. And then, species come together to form ecosystems. You have a biosphere at this planetary level, and even a global brain. So that's the story of evolution. It's this story of evolutionary transitions, but transitions also occur within an individual. So the individual mirrors the evolutionary trajectory of society as well, or the biosphere. So yeah, the brain's hierarchical as well. You have this mode that you're in a lot of the time where you're just completely immersed in your first person perspective, and you're just kind of acting on autopilot, and you're kind of acting on your biological programming that has been hardwired over millions of years of evolution. And then there's this other way of looking at things that your brain shifts into at other times that's associated with the prefrontal cortex. And then you get metacognition and you become aware that you're consciousness, and you get self-awareness. And then you can look at yourself and you can see, maybe I'm not behaving in the optimal way. Maybe I'm acting according to urges, or I'm acting according to, because I'm angry about something. And that awareness allows you to modulate your behavior and tweak your model of the world. And then that leads to optimal behavior, not just for the individual, but for society as a whole. And then there's another level where you can become aware that you're not just this self-aware agent, you are part of an interconnected network of other agents that are part of a society. And you can have this kind of bird's eye view, and you can look at how your actions affect the actions of the whole. And so it's kind of a meta awareness that we can cultivate. And I think it's absolutely essential for a functioning society, and for us to transition to a higher level, we all have to be meta aware. So yeah, this concept of hierarchy is important in evolution, but it's also important for the individual.
When I talk to people like John Vervaeke or others around some version of the religion that's not a religion,
Yeah.
I always bring up occultism, which is clearly a field fraught with problems. But at the same time, since the alchemists, it's been an experimental playground for transcultural scientific illuminism, people trying to bring reason and intuition and science and ritual and meditative practice together. So it's obviously a predecessor in a way of some of this kind of work. It doesn't get the same kind of respect that we give to neuroscience-friendly Eastern meditation practices and things like that. And I think part of that is because of this deep ambiguity around the concept of magic.
Yeah.
And I know you put a little bit of thought into this. So what is it that makes you interested in magic generally? What do you think the word even means? And what are you pointing to with this notion of causal magic?
Yeah, so it's something I haven't written about, but I will write about it on the Road to Omega Substack soon. And it's something that I've been discussing with others for a while. While I was writing the book, this sort of network of like-minded individuals came together, maybe even a decade before that, in a consciousness club we had at George Mason University, but it started becoming really diverse. And so one thing that we understood, so writing the book, and I'm making this argument that the universe is becoming increasingly complex, and it has this role for life, this sort of teleological role where the universe is, going in the direction of this goal of this maximally complex state. And immediately when you start to make that argument, there's a lot of people in the scientific community who think that that's opposed to naturalism. And they might call this idea, without even inspecting it or understanding the mechanisms involved, pseudoscience or woo, or even emergence was really controversial. Like, I think it's really in the last 5 years or so that emergence, most people in the scientific community, are starting to say that, this is an important concept that we need to recognize. But 10 years before that, because emergence wasn't well defined, just talking about like causal emergence or strong emergence, these are terms that are used pretty commonly now. It was controversial because everything ultimately was thought that, you could understand things at the level of atoms, and that anything that you were talking about at this higher level, like organisms acting as agents or mind having causal power, that was thought to be kind of an illusion, and that everything that was important was happening at this low level. So it became apparent that concepts outside the current scientific paradigm, which was the reductionist paradigm, were just assumed to be pseudoscience or magical concepts. And so it became really clear that these things that some people, and usually it's because the people didn't have enough knowledge, kind of suffering from the Dunning-Kruger effect. You don't know what you don't know. And so, people like Sean Carroll have written about emergence, people who are trusted in the physics world. So, that problem's getting better. But before, if you would write about some of these things, it was just considered outside the realm of science. But what you understand pretty quickly when you look into this literature and the new work that's kind of showing, okay, teleological systems, we have these goal-oriented systems in nature. They're different than inanimate systems. You can't predict them with Newtonian mechanics. You can't predict them with the equations of like fundamental physics, but you can start to understand their behavior when you start to think of them as computational or informational systems. So we started to understand that teleology was just referring to the power of information, and that this sort of vitalistic force, which is how biologists described it 100 or 200 years ago, where you see this kind of, behavior in living things where it just seems like they're propelled by some sort of mystical force because they don't act like other objects in the physical world. It's because those systems have information that's been encoded in the system, built up through evolution and through learning. So teleology and vitalism was never like magic or a mystical force. It was the power of information. So when I say causal magic, it's basically referring to stuff outside the current scientific paradigm, which is real and has a causal mechanism behind it, but it appears to be magic to anyone who's not aware of this, yet to be this science that hasn't been understood. Like that framework is still in the future. So some examples I give are the fact that a garage door opener, if you could bring Newton here, if you can bring Isaac Newton here in a time machine, and you press the button and the garage door starts opening, it would look like magic. It would be like, how is this cause you hitting the button, creating the effect of something far away, like moving? It would be completely indistinguishable from magic. And you have the famous Arthur C. Clarke quote, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." And that's sort of the principle of causal magic. It just basically says that there are things that we will learn in the near future that will allow for possibilities and technologies that if you told someone today this is going to be possible in the near future, they would go, that's magic. That's not science. That's sorcery. That's wizardry. And it's really interesting because, so for example, quantum mechanics, if someone, 150 years ago said, we're going to find out that subatomic particles can be multiple places at once, and they can be entangled, meaning they can be on, separated. They can be on different sides of the galaxy in an entangled pair of particles. And if you measure one, it will have an instant effect on the other. That would completely seem to be magic and violate all laws of physics as we knew it, as we knew them back then. But now quantum mechanics is completely accepted because that magic was shown to have this, causal explanation, and was shown through experiment and repeated experiment. And so now it's accepted as science. So we should leave room for surprises. The future is a magical place, and there's a lot that we haven't discovered. And you can play a kind of fun game and try to come up with, the causal magic of the future, like what's next. And yeah, I don't know. I've had some ideas about that, but yeah. What do you think about causal magic?
Well,
And does it? So Scout Wiley, she's really interesting to me. I saw her interview with Brendan, our mutual friend, for his channel on metamodern magic, and all the stuff that she was talking about. I was like, this is causal magic. This is an extension of that. I mean, it can be as simple as when I was writing my book, I felt that it was very helpful to have a certain aesthetic that was sort of supporting a cosmic mindset. So I would have like crystals and ambient music, and I would, and not like crystals like I was worshiping and getting power from. I was just having an aesthetic that represented nature. And like I got this like little like projector light that creates this kind of cosmic background, and got really deep into like ambient music, like Brian Eno and like Laraji, for example. And that sort of, if you're writing about like cosmic evolution, you will write better when you design your niche to be supportive of your mindset. So that's a form of niche construction. You think about, how animals like beavers build dams, and that niche is kind of considered part of the organism, like an extension of the organism. Well, we can design our rooms to sort of be extensions of our mind, and that can be really helpful and lead you to create creative works that you wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. With the books, it was like, I could have these books as PDF files on my computer, but there's something about having them behind me, where I'm writing something about, let's say, emergence, and someone wrote about it in 1920, let's say, like C.L. Morgan, and because it's behind you, I might take a break and look back. That I can access that information, or it's more salient in my mind, because I have a physical symbol of it in my room. So there's a lot of things that you can do to sort of design your life such that you have these kind of creative superpowers. And I would consider that part of causal magic as well. But yeah, so maybe you can tell me a little bit about how that lines up with how you understood metamodern magic. I know you and Scott had a conversation about that. Scout, sorry.
Yeah, I think the minimum for entry into the discussion is to be trans-rational rather than pre-rational.
Okay, can you explain that?
There's this is like a thing out of developmental theory, which is to say of any situation that you think about that you would define as conventional, there's a way of not yet having understood what it's trying to say, and there's a way of having understood it, incorporated it, and open to what else might be going on. Okay. So there are people who are trying to be rationalistic, which is one of the beautiful gifts of modern civilization. And there are other people who feel like that's a limitation. Now, why do they feel like that's a limitation? Because they've understood it, they appreciate it, they're working with it, and they're trying to unfold other things? Or do they fundamentally resist actually accepting the conclusions and the rigor and the discipline of the sciences? So when a rational person critiques a trans-rational person because they can't tell the difference between rational and trans-rational, you've got a problem. You've also got a problem if the trans-rational people can't tell themselves apart from the pre-rational people. So there's a lot of nuanced teasing apart and parsing that needs to go on in order to have a good conversation. Yeah. That said, assuming we're having that conversation, I think there's a tremendous possibility to have a more participatory framework about how we engage with life. It's one of the things Verbekey's working on a lot. Like, how do we have a good conscience about being participatory meaning makers? And what is the sign that we're being successful as participatory meaning makers? And I think one of the signs, I go back to Nietzsche on this, like from Nietzsche's point of view, the idea that there's someone who designed the world for you is foolish. But when you're having the feeling that the world is almost perfectly designed for you, that means you're succeeding. You're achieving a higher level integration of your various parts, which include the parts of you that are doing the perceiving. So the experience of synchronicities and overflows of meaningful coincidence, these sort of resonance which our ancestors bequeathed to us, certain tools that might be practical in helping us with that. Transpersonal archetypal images, certain kinds of practices, like you were describing, certain kinds of mood building and niche creation. Anything that helps us get into that state allows us to activate a more collaborative arrangement of our different parts. I tend to view the psyche as pluralistic. And so I think a lot of spiritual practice. I call it the integration surplus model. But for me, what spirituality is really trying to do is bring together multiple subsystems within the individual in a way that creates a surplus that's more than the sum of the parts. And then we have some relation to that surplus in a first, second, or third person modality, whatever we want to do. But the production of that extra, that sort of numinous additional meaningfulness, that's the indicator that the system's actually working properly by achieving a higher level collaboration of your underlying psychological systems. That's how
That's
I
super
can.
interesting. Yeah, I didn't know Nietzsche wrote about that. You'll have to like point me to those exact sources. So yeah, there's something highly practical about that way of thinking, and I think, you know, in extreme too, you can have problems with that thinking, and we see that all the time with like magical thinking with people with like schizophrenia. But there's people who have this sort of magical thinking. I mean, I would say most religious people have this sort of thinking, and it can be extremely practical and beneficial to your life. And if that's true, then it seems like anyone who just out of, you know, the worldview they have that says anything that mentions magic is terrible because, you know, people use these ideas in harmful ways. It's you're kind of holding yourself back from your full potential. Rituals too, I think, can be extremely important, and there's not much of a difference between rituals and things like meditation. And neuroscience has pretty much accepted meditation as being great for individuals. So like, why are you crossing some sort of line when you talk about the importance of rituals? So I think that's another part of metamodernism, is that you're kind of like transcending that old scientific view where there's this culture war between science and religion, or science and spirituality. And that's one thing I try to do in the book, is like make spirituality like not a dirty word for scientists anymore. And people like Carl Sagan talked about the importance of spirituality, and Albert Einstein, that science, the process of science is you know, a very spiritual process for people that look at it in that way. You mentioned synchronicity, so here's one example of, you know, something that I would call causal magic. So people experience these synchronicities all the time where they are thinking of a friend. It's you know, a friend popped in their head, and suddenly you get a phone call from that friend, and you're like, holy shit, like that was like total synchronicity. You tell them, and they're like, wow, yeah. And sometimes they're like, I didn't even know, like, you know, why I felt the urge to call you, but I did. And so it's crazy that you thought of me at the same time. And you might think to yourself, like, wow, you know, I haven't thought about that friend in 5 years. Like, what are the chances of that happening? And then so you explain that to, like, you know, like a rational person, they would go, well, that's like that's a bias, that's the product, I think it's called confirmation bias, but that's like a product of the fact that you probably think about them unconsciously all the time. And when they called, it became apparent that you were thinking about them, but it wasn't so much of a coincidence. You're just thinking about them all the time, and you're not realizing it. So that's one explanation for that phenomenon that I think could be wrong. There could actually be something that someone might call something like mind reading, but it has nothing to do with anything outside of science. It's mechanistic, and I'll explain to you what I mean right here by that. So let's imagine that you met a friend, let's say like 20 years ago at a party, and you guys were having a discussion about how much you liked the TV show Twin Peaks. And you kind of bonded that night at the party over David Lynch's Twin Peaks. And then you maybe forgot that you ever even had that discussion. You became good friends, and you liked, you know, you talked about movies all the time, and you had the same sort of taste, and you became good friends. And then maybe you moved, and you hadn't seen that person in like 5 or 10 years. And then suddenly a new Twin Peaks comes out, where 20 years later, the show is coming back and you're seeing ads for that show around, and you're not even connecting it to your friend. But yeah, so let's say it's like the first time that ad's produced and you and your friend are on Facebook and you're scrolling through your feed and it's like Twin Peaks comes out. And when you see that, there's an association with your friend where you go suddenly, oh, I wonder what Jim's doing. Haven't talked to him for a while. I'm going to send him an email. And then like you send that person an email, that person gets it. They just saw the thing too, and they were primed to think of you. And suddenly you experience this insanely strong synchronicity. And you're like, holy shit, here's the thing. The skeptics' explanation for that you were always, you kept thinking of that person, throughout the day, and that it, just happened to be this hit this time, that explanation would not be the right explanation. There would be this mental causal connection from this shared stimulus that you're not even thinking about. So when I tell people that, when I'm like, okay, this synchronicity could have like this deeper explanation that is not explained by the mechanism that you're telling me. Like when they hear that, they go, oh, that you're talking about magic. You're talking about something like psychic or something. And then I explain this new mechanistic explanation. They go, oh, okay, yeah, that's fine. I believe that. That's not against anything that I would think of. But prior to you explaining that mechanism, they would go, it's impossible. So once they hear it, then it gets incorporated into their scientific framework. And suddenly you have something that was previously considered magic until you explain the mechanism behind it, be a part of science. And so that's what the evolution of science is. There's this realm of metaphysics, that stuff that science doesn't cover. And we talk about it and philosophize about it. And then there's science, there's stuff that we've understood mechanistically and that we've tested. And it's not really clear where the boundary between science and philosophy or science and metaphysics is. And as science learns more, it starts to subsume that realm of the metaphysical. So again, it comes back to this idea that stuff considered magic may be real. It's just stuff that we haven't understood the mechanisms for. And there is no such thing as magic without a mechanism. Everything must have a mechanism, even if it's a mechanism that we don't understand. Entanglement has a mechanism. You measure something here and there's this effect there. It's not, you don't see this mechanical connection where there's this chain of events where one thing's affecting something locally that affects something and there's this chain reaction. It's this mysterious thing, but there's still a causal connection. So we need to be careful when we're saying things are woo. For example, like Rupert Sheldrake is this British scientist who has this theory of morphogenetic fields, where he thinks that, for example, it kind of explains the phenomenon where someone thinks of something and then suddenly everybody, like all these people across the world, are like thinking of the same idea suddenly. And he thinks that when there's a pattern at some place, that pattern can emerge more easily at other places. And his TED Talk got banned because it was called pseudoscience. Now, I'm not saying that his theory is right. There's a lot of ambiguity and unexplained stuff about how this could happen. But what it can do is some scientists can read Sheldrake's theory and go, oh, shit. Like, yeah, that phenomenon does happen. One thing he mentions is like, you can have like rats like trying to solve like a maze puzzle. And then like when they solve it, like you will see like in a different lab that the same puzzle will be solved more quickly. So, there are these, so a scientist could read about that, and then they could know something that Sheldrake doesn't know and go, oh, there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for why this happens. It isn't exactly what he was thinking, and it maybe is a little bit less magical, but it's some shit that we didn't know before, and it's kind of a game changer. And if we completely like try to like ban and like suppress those far out theories that are like on the edge of science, but like try to explain some phenomena that seems, stuff that people experience, whether they're experiencing it in the right way or not, it's really important that we don't cut that off, because then we won't see the answers from a scientific perspective. Like, we just won't know that's possible. And science fiction is always kind of like pushing the boundaries of how we think. And most ideas from science, like, were part of science fiction at first, things that didn't seem possible at all. And then we start to understand that you can do those things. The multiverse theory, for example, that was considered a metaphysical theory, the idea that there were parallel universes or something. Now, a lot of theoretical physicists accept the many worlds hypothesis. I'm not saying it's right, but Sean Carroll wrote a whole book recently because he was persuaded by this. David Deutsch, the founder of quantum computation, supports the many worlds theory. So yeah, we have to have an open mind about things, but you're right. The transrational people have to be able to articulate how they're different from the pre-rational people. They have to be able to explain, okay, I understand the rational mindset, and I understand why you're against, like, for example, crystal healing. I mean, some of that stuff can be really dangerous because people who have cancer hears from some new age guru that they can buy this crystal and cure their cancer, and then they die because they don't get proper medical treatment. So I understand the danger of it, but we have to, again, understand that there's good and bad with all these things and kind of transcend these old ways of thinking. And I think it's super important. And I think it will create new excitement for people getting into science who are maybe, more spiritually inclined people. They can see, all right, there's lots of opportunity to discover new, exciting things. And I think that's where we are right now. We're like on the verge of this paradigm shift where tons of stuff that we thought things that didn't seem possible suddenly become possible.
Oh, there's a ton of stuff I relate to in there. Yeah. I used to be a real hardliner against the many worlds interpretation, but David Deutsch tipped me over into taking it seriously. I talked to Rupert Sheldrake last year. I'm pretty skeptical of a lot of his ideas, but what I'm really in favor of is the way that he's holding open pathways for scientific investigation, which I think is a major function of science, which tends to get suppressed by some of the bureaucratic ethos that's been set up around science over the years.
Yeah.
I think one of the big questions for me is sort of like, and we don't know the answer, how big is the niche that we've evolved to be adapted to, right? Is it really local? So when we have an intuitive response to something that doesn't seem rational, is it just based on our local survival circumstances in a particular biological situation on the Earth? Or have we also adapted to some kind of non-local information entanglement that might be mediated subatomically through the right hemisphere of the brain? Like, we just don't know how rich the actual inputs are that we've adapted to. So it might be that our intuition tells us something very limited, or it might be that it tells us hugely interesting things about a vast range of the cosmos. That's an area we have to continually explore and get this balance right between not preemptively shutting down investigations that seem metaphysical or science fiction-y, but also not taking them just at face value. We've got to bring a strong discerning commitment to this.
Yeah, and that makes me think of a neuroscientist I mentioned earlier that I'd be interviewing later in the year named John Joe McFadden. So he's a molecular biologist and really respected in his field. He wrote a book called Quantum Biology. And like 15 years ago, everybody would say that's bullshit. If you said like, oh, I'm working in quantum biology, they'd be like, oh, you're one of these like Deepak Chopra people who are, abusing language and trying to make, you're basically talking about these magical things that don't exist using scientific language. But then we found out that many biological processes use quantum processes. So photosynthesis uses quantum mechanics, and bird navigation. So like birds navigate using, photosynthesis uses quantum tunneling. And I think the bird navigation might use entanglement in some weird way. But that's an example of kind of what you were talking about. There's like this mechanism that's not a mechanism that comes from just a traditional understanding of biology in an organism. adapting to its niche. It is still that in a larger sense, but like no one would have thought that there was anything quantum. Now it's completely accepted that biology uses quantum processes. Every big publication from Scientific American to New Scientist to Nature all recognize that. But it's yeah, and so it's not just that we should say, "Oh, cool! I'm glad we learned those things." We have to be angry at the people who were like, "This is not science." Like those people were holding back science by having that mentality, and it's a shame because when we learn this new thing like quantum biology, there's not a change in the culture that goes, "Hey, maybe we should be a little bit more open to this other stuff." Like nothing really changes. So yeah, there does need to be this change in mindset where we become more open to stuff. But the hard thing about it is, how do we not become so open-minded? They say that like our brains fall out, but like how do we allow ourselves to be open to things like that without being susceptible to ideas like homeopathy or crystal healing? And I'm not sure there's a good answer to that, but we have to try. We have to find a way to be open without opening up people to dangers of gurus who are just trying to sell them snake oil.
Yeah, and it's really hard to gauge that in a world that's changing very quickly, right? I mean, one of the classic lines is physics proceeds one funeral at a time, right? And that's the old method for updating, is generationally. Okay.
Yeah.
But the world, well, that's fine when the world stays roughly constant. You can just ask the next generation to adapt to the new circumstance. But if it changes several times within an individual lifetime, then we have to have a much faster updating mechanism. And that puts our guesses about what's too radical into question, right? There's a lot of say, right? Well, this is radical politics, but if it's not addressing the scale and tempo of the changes that are besetting the civilization, I mean, it's just crazy to be moderate in a world that's moving really fast. But
Yep.
if we have to then give up our intuitive feeling about what's moderate and what's radical, where do we go from there?
Yeah. Yeah. To me, it's super exciting because suddenly, everything seems possible. So the problem that you mentioned is uniquely a problem of the time we're living in, because the rate of progress does increase exponentially. So like 100 years ago, especially like 500 or 1,000 years ago, there wasn't this problem. Like everything was progressing so slowly that you weren't confused about what could be real and what's not. But now, like there's no predicting what's going to happen. And with the emergence of the chat GPT, just its ability to craft essays that are, not just indistinguishable from like a human essay, but in many examples are better than like the average blogger. And I thought we were at least 10 years away from that sort of technology. So after experiencing that, I don't think chat GPT is conscious. And I don't think it's like super intelligent. I don't think we have any sort of reason to worry about that particular language model, becoming sentient and becoming maybe so powerful that, it challenges humans or something. But could something emerge in the next 5 years or 10 years that is like a super intelligence? I don't know. I like when I started writing the book, I was, and even years before writing the book, I wrote an article for Psychology Today and the Huffington Post that was called "The Myth of Sentient Machines." And it was basically kind of regurgitating the philosopher John Searle's argument based on things like the Chinese room experiment, that computers couldn't be conscious and that consciousness was something biological, and that AI would always remain weak AI. or narrow AI. So weak AI was just the old word for narrow AI. So you can make artificial intelligence systems that are great at solving specific problems in a specific domain, but having one that has this general intelligence and that passes the Turing test, that was maybe not even like centuries away, but just maybe impossible in theory. And now I'm not so sure about that at all. And it's kind of a creepy feeling too. It's exciting, it's scary, but like suddenly I feel like the whole AGI superintelligence, people like, Musk and Stephen Hawking and Sam Harris being concerned about, the potential problems that could arise from AGI, like suddenly those are real concerns to me. And yeah, I'm not I'm not sure exactly what we can do about it. We got to be thinking about it and what we can do, but we're not fully in control of this process of progress, and things are going to start happening faster and faster, and I'm not sure where it's leading.
It does seem like it is a situation that opens itself up to a re-investigation, a new inquiry around something like magic. Or for me, I do a lot of work around shamanism of certain kinds, because the
Very
world
cool.
is less reliable, right? We're not sure. If you see something, that's not proof it happened. If you interact with something, it might not be a human. Everything's so uncanny and permeable and fluid and unpredictable now that it seems to be a situation in which you might have to reach out for nonlinear consciousness, imaginal capacities, various other kinds of ways to participate and interact. But then that brings us back to the question of how do you do that wisely versus how do you do that foolishly? What's opening up possibilities and what's closing them down? A lot of what I do is teaching practices around the development of metacognition. But there's also a lot of privilege involved there. The number of people who can or have already achieved a fairly good degree of metacognition, who are construct aware and can hold all these experiences in an as if position, that's a relatively small percentage of the population. And the rest of the population, who might be more dogmatic, more symbolically inclined in how they relate to the world, they're facing the same situation, and they need tools so that they can be in their best states, and then they cannot get overwhelmed and disoriented by a really crazy, confusing, almost dreamlike kind of future that's emerging. So
Yeah.
I find it really difficult to mediate between, on the one hand, my focus on doing these things in a transrational fashion and my awareness that a lot of people are not in a position to be able to do it that way, and they also need help.
Yeah, well, I'm glad there are people like you out there working on it. I think one thing that can maybe help with that is this paradigm that I described at the beginning of our talk, that is what the book is about, that explains evolution as this process of hierarchical self-organization where things come together to make larger wholes, parts come together to make larger wholes, and those things become the next level in this process of complexity growth, and it continues on. So from that, we see, we can start to make sense of things. We can see an outline of the evolutionary process. There's this process of emergent systems where something like a global brain is forming. So that can tell us a lot about what's going on with society. We're becoming more interconnected and integrated, and that could lead to some sort of global intelligence, which is a good thing. It can be a bad thing too if we let it go down the direction of becoming this homogenous hive mind. We need to preserve the diversity of ideas in the system, but we do want this integration because it means there's more information exchange throughout the network. But that would lead to human civilization that can solve our existential problems, when if we don't come together in that way, we're not exploiting the full computational power of the global brain, and we will be unable to solve problems like what to do about, AGI, or what to do about climate change or income inequality. So we have to come together to solve our problems. And to do that, it requires a unifying worldview. What a worldview does is align the interest of the agents in a particular culture. And if you have different worldviews, then you have basically, so right now in the US, we're becoming so divided that we have like a left-wing social organism and a right-wing social organism, where the nation used to be just one collective superorganism. When we become ideologically divided into these two social organisms, those organisms will be in conflict. They'll be competing. They'll be at war. So what we need to do is have a unifying paradigm that is kind of this sense-making lens that aligns our interests. And I think this paradigm of recursive emergence, you could call it, this cosmic evolution paradigm I've been explaining, can do that. And so it's kind of this meta-modern paradigm where we accept all of the good things about the Enlightenment period and modern thinking, but we also accept that this sort of causal magic, meta-modern magic aspect of the world and spirituality. There are all of these things that we don't understand, that we shouldn't rule out. And I think that can bridge the secular and the spiritual in a way where everybody can say, okay, like I see how I see why you believe what you believe, and we don't need to be in different camps. So this process of hierarchical self-organization will naturally lead to the emergence of this global consciousness at this, larger societal level. But what it requires is this there's a hierarchical process within the individual as well, where you have to have this meta perspective, and those two things go together. So the emergence of this global consciousness requires that everybody has this meta awareness. And so even though the future is a scary place, we can see where it's going in rough outline. And that brings sense to everything. Oh, we're going through this period because we're part of this complex system. And before a phase transition, there's always a chaotic period because a system that's too rigid can't transition to a higher state. So that makes sense of all the chaos that we're seeing right now. Peter Turchin is a scientist who actually predicted the age of chaos in 2020 back in 2010, I think, in a Nature paper. It was some big journal, and the Atlantic and the New York Times has written about this. So there are predictable cycles that you can see if you do have this evolutionary cybernetic worldview of hierarchical self-organization, and it tells us where we're going, and it tells us when there's going to be periods of chaos. And if we can predict that, then we can kind of steer things in the direction they need to go to avoid collapse. Because when a social organism goes through a phase transition, it can either transition to a state of higher order, or it can collapse and then it restarts again. So metamodernism can't just be this thing where people are just saying like, oh, it's the next thing after postmodernism, and there are all these like cute little ideas about like ironic sincerity and things that I think are really fun parts of the paradigm. But you absolutely need this evolutionary story, this story of hierarchical organization. Like there is this grand narrative, and if we don't see it, we're kind of lost. The future is going to be a scary place. But when you do see it, it adds a whole new element of predictability that sort of gives a roadmap for progress.
Yeah, I have a little bit of ambiguity around the narrative, around the world picture. Brendan and I talk about this a lot because
okay, yeah,
it is roughly the kind of world that I see, right? And I wonder how much of that is produced, by the dynamics that generate meta perspectives in individuals and lead them to reorganize their understanding of reality to create a picture like that, versus how much could be inculcated in them in a kind of top-down fashion by hearing about or learning about that kind of world description. And it seems like, I'm When I think about religion and spirituality, like I was talking about spirituality as a kind of production of an excess coherence through the relationship of internal systems, I think there's a parallel interpersonally that we might call religion. We create something like a spirit that's shared between people. And I think that's necessary to organize, it's necessary to put the pieces of our current worldview together. And that there are certain stories and framings that allow us to do that. So I'm all behind that, but I'm always a little bit wary that priests and journalists and pundits and professors and people who have a lot of literate training tend to lean in the direction of stories are needed. We've got to be able to like write down or tell a story. I'm like, is that kind of a confirmation bias for people who are themselves very invested in stories and communication, or is it an essential piece of the puzzle? Do we need to be outputting this worldview, or is this worldview something that simply emerges from people doing practices together that create the kind of consciousness that organizes reality in that mode?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think it is truly the story of nature. I think the theory of everything that we're looking for, it's not a fundamental physics theory, because those theories leave out life, consciousness, and culture. And those are the things that we're most interested in. And they're real. Consciousness has causal power. When I make the decision to raise my hand, it's literally because I've made this conscious decision to do so. It's not just the result of particles bouncing around. There's higher level causes, because systems emerge which have information embedded in those systems, which gives this, higher level phenomenon that we call mind actual conscious power. So yeah, so the theory of everything we're looking for is not so much a mathematical theory, but a story. And it's the story of the universe coming alive or waking up, and it does that through life. So you have these series of nested emergences where subatomic particles come together to make atoms, which come together to make molecules, which come together to make cells, and so on. But in this story, biology isn't just this sort of accidental offshoot. It's not an anomaly. It's part of this nested structure that we can expect. And Greg Enriquez has depicted this process in what he calls the tree of knowledge. And you see this this hierarchy with matter, life, mind, and culture that becomes very clear. But so if you buy this story, then biology becomes the driver of cosmic evolution. And by that, I mean, right now, this thing that I've called a global brain is emerging, and it seems like it has some sort of intelligence. I don't know if you can have consciousness at the level of this like planetary organism, but whatever is associated with this next level, that's the next emergence after life, mind, and culture. Teilhard de Chardin, an old professor of mine, Harold Morowitz, who was inspired by Teilhard, and he was one of the founding members of the Santa Fe Institute and the founding editor of the journal Complexity. They both thought that the next emergence would be something of a spiritual nature. And I think that emergence is basically when we become integrated in such a way that there's not these separate nations, that there is this globally unified way. What I think we'll see is that if there's some sort of humanitarian problem, the way there's like sort of trends on social media and hashtags to bring relief to that, I think we'll be able to do that like far quicker, to where the whole thing is kind of like an organism. And if there's a problem, like you get a cut in your hand, there's immediately mechanisms to like repair that, or an immune system response to something. And I think when we have that level of causal power, where there's this problem and it immediately gets solved by the collective action of everyone on Earth, it's going to feel spiritual. There's suddenly, we have our conscious experience, but there's going to be something that feels almost like magical about what we're able to do with our collective causal power. And I think that's the next emergence. But this planetary scale thing that I'm talking about, that sounds like far out and like, larger than life, like, maybe a planetary consciousness, whatever you call this, it's just the next stage in a ladder of stages. So people like Ray Kurzweil believe that as we merge with our technology, we'll spread outward. If life is to exist, if consciousness and creativity is to persist in the universe, if it's to go on, life must get off the planet before the sun dies. And that goes for life everywhere in the universe. Life has to evolve into a technological society that can spread outside of its solar system, or else when those stars die, that's the end of life. That's the end of consciousness in the only reality that we know, this universe. So the second law of thermodynamics creates something like a game clock for life, and any intelligent species that emerges anywhere that gains self-awareness is going to realize that they have this biological imperative, and that's for life to spread, and that there's this spiritual, it's a spiritual imperative too, because if creativity, if love, all these things that we consider, great things about humanity is to persist, we have to overcome these goals. And so if that's the case, then you get life spreading, and then the network that becomes, intelligent or conscious at the planetary scale, that's just a very small fraction of the larger process. You can have intelligent beings spread throughout a galaxy that are informationally connected, and then you get the emergence of a consciousness at like a galactic level, and maybe even the cosmic level. So Herbert Spencer, Teilhard de Chardin, modern people like Ray Kurzweil, David Deutsch, Seth Lloyd, people see this as, or at least entertain the idea as this being the, inevitable future of the evolutionary process. Physicists like Paul Davies, Julian Barber, Lee Smolin, they've all speculated about this. So if that's true, then this worldview is not just something that like has emerged because it's practical for us, like a good way of looking at the world. It is the story of nature, and that infuses life with meaning and purpose, because suddenly you're like, wow, our species isn't just this, weird, quirky offshoot of naturalistic processes. It's baked in to the cosmic evolution process, and it's actually essential for this process to continue. And humanity is not something like a virus that's like killing the planet. We have done lots of damage, and we continue to do damage, but it's all a process of learning and adaptation. So as we start to hurt the environment and we feel the effects of that, then humanity has people such as yourself and people like John Vervaeke who are like, looking that we need to find solutions to these, whether they're environmental problems or like internal problems, like this meaning crisis that people like him talk about. In the book, I have this principle that I call Popper's principle, named after Karl Popper, which says that problems create progress. So if we didn't have problems, we wouldn't be forced to seek out solutions, and progress would come to a halt. Society would become stagnant. So the existential threats we face aren't evidence that progress isn't inevitable. It's actually the fundamental driver of progress. Our problems and the fact that we will have them forever. Even if we have this emergence of this global consciousness or whatever that is, there will continue to be problems. And even if we go into the metaverse and we start experiencing these crazy digital realities, that can only last for so long, because the whole system still needs to extract free energy from the environment. So again, we have this problem of getting off the star. So we're not going to go like fully immersed into the metaverse and stop caring about everything in the real world. It's this progress of life spreading. And to me, if you don't understand that and accept that as part of reality, then we're just kind of lost. We don't know where it's going. But if you do recognize that, then suddenly it turns life into something like a challenge and a game, this kind of cosmic game that we're part of. And I think taking this perspective, which I call the teleological stance, and I've written about that on my Substack, I think has all this practical utility, because it sees us as part of this collective, and we have to come together and combine our causal powers to solve our problems. But it's not just a useful way of looking at things. It's the way that reality is. Nature is completely trippy and psychedelic, and conscious agents have this larger role to play in the process of cosmic evolution.
I think it's really interesting to wonder about how local or general our position is at the leading edge of that, which is vague. The first biopsychosocial model of hierarchical consciousness I got into as a kid was Timothy Leary's 8-circuit model. And Tim believed that like what the biosphere was doing was kind of like a plant going through its cycle of growth and flowering, that this was a thing that biospheres have done many times, and ours is unfolding through these set stages that are built into it. So that's one way to look at it, is this has happened before. We're not starting the process, but we are participating in it. Same kind of thing when you think about, consciousness at the level of the solar system or the galaxy, right? That could be something that we could generate one day, or it might have always been the case, or it might be something that was achieved at some point prior to us. And then do we think of ourselves as like the real leading edge? Or is that narcissistic? Or is it really useful to think of ourselves as the leading edge, even if it's happened before?
How could it have happened before? I'm confused about that part.
Well, imagine like a panspermia idea, where tiny little microorganisms get transferred to planets, and many other planets have gone through this cycle, and the stages are like laid out for us already, like human life cycle.
I see. So not in this solar system, but other distant places in the universe. Yeah. So there's panspermia, and there's directed panspermia, so panspermia says that life on this planet could have been seeded from life on other planets. It could have traveled here in like a meteor or something. And the reason people considered this is because the problem of the origin of life wasn't understood, and it seemed so unlikely that we didn't have a mechanism, and we thought, it's an easier explanation to assume that it came from somewhere else, but it kind of just pushes the problem back. So I think, I think we can explain how it emerged now through this.
There's an advantage to feeling like it's never been done before, even if it's been done before. Like what we're going through could conceivably have happened on countless worlds that we'll never know about. Is that a useful, interesting part of our world picture? Or is it more important to motivate ourselves by feeling like maybe this has never happened before?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, just to go back to the panspermia thing. So even though I don't support panspermia, it's possible. And people like Carl Sagan and Francis Crick entertained it. And Francis Crick actually supported something called directed panspermia, which is even more far out. And it's the idea that life didn't just travel here on a meteor, that it was intentionally put here by an alien civilization that was trying to seed other planets with intelligent life. And whether or not you believe that, which I don't tend to believe, I do think this process is happening elsewhere in the universe. Has it already happened to the point where like intelligence has spread throughout like a galaxy somewhere else far away in the universe? Possibly, but I tend to believe that it's all sort of happening at a similar rate, because, for example, life couldn't have emerged. The universe is 14 billion years old, but it couldn't have emerged like 9 billion years ago, because the cosmic evolution process that involves like stellar and planetary evolution were required for life. So stars had to create the higher elements, and those stars had to die. And basically, when those stars died, they sent out the heavier elements that then, under the force of gravity, coalesced into planets. So part of me thinks that, I'm arguing that this process is inevitable, but that it happens on a similar time scale throughout the universe. So I think we might be like the leading edge of that. If it's happened on places like slightly earlier, we're still the leading edge in this corner of the cosmos. And we know we're the most intelligent species on Earth. Some might say like, oh, and humans aren't intelligent. Like you just have this like a postmodernist would say, you just have this conception of intelligence, but it's not really in any objective sense. We're not like superior. But I don't think that's true, because we can leave the planet. There's no other species that can put matter from the Earth on the moon. Sarah Walker, the physicist and origin of life researcher, she points out that anti-accretion, like accretion is planets pulling matter into it, anti-accretion is sending matter out, like we do with satellites and putting rockets on the moon. That process requires life and knowledge and intelligence. So if you see anti-accretion out there in the universe, that's signs of intelligent life. David Deutsch, in his book, The Fabric of Reality, talks about like how you can see, I think, the Great Wall of China from space. When you fly in planes, you see this like at night, you see everything lit up, like it's like a bioluminescence of the planet, but it's all of our technology and electrical systems that we can see from that part in space. So humans, the human species has transformed the planet into something different, and it's radically different than it looked before life. And if this process continues, life is going to transform the entire universe into something that has a different structure and a different, sort of dynamical process. Like it will just look different. The way everything will have this sort of intelligence and agency that we don't see with the inanimate world. So I do think where the drivers of this complexification process, and you asked, is it just something that helps us to look at it this way? I think it's both. I think it's real, but I think looking at it that way allows humanity to have this sort of perspective that motivates them to continue the process. So the feeling that you get when you have this sudden realization that we're part of this process, and that maybe gives us a cosmic responsibility to do what we can to see that life flourishes. That doesn't mean, trying to go into a career at SpaceX or something. It can just be, you can be an artist and you're contributing to the diversity of ideas, and the diversity of ideas is an important part of progress, because complexity is a function of how integrated and diverse a system is. So a system with lots of variety is more complex. So with the teleological stance that I talk about on my Substack, the idea is that you have this cosmic story and that life is part of it, and that humanity has to kind of become aware of this sort of cosmic responsibility. And then that gives your life, your individual life, purpose and meaning. But that our way to contribute to that process can be as simple as just coming up with new ideas, or just creating something that someone hasn't created before. So yeah, it's practical, but I also think it's this fundamental part of the cosmos and how the universe is evolving. And to me, I mean, it's kind of like an idea that kind of like radicalizes you in the best way possible. It's this cosmic religion that says we have like the grandest purpose of all. And it's not, someone could argue that it's like anthropomorphic and it's kind of like narcissistic. But in this view, humans are interdependent humans are dependent on everything else in the interconnected, interdependent network. And also we're evolving ourselves into something higher. A lot of people are afraid of us merging with technology, but I think all technology does is enhances the sort of human qualities of life. So with increased intelligence from like computer chips being implanted in the brain and brain computer interfaces, where we become more compassionate beings, and that this evolutionary process towards higher intelligence has this moral arc. So we become more moral and more compassionate because we become more aware that there are other agents like us who can also experience happiness and suffering. So yeah, I think it's not just something, not just a worldview that has utility, it's truly part of the story of nature. And to me, there's nothing more psychedelic and exciting than that. And when I fully felt like, okay, this is not just something that I want to believe, this is something that if you look at the evolutionary process and you understand it mechanistically, this is true, then it's just like completely sort of like fills your being with purpose. You're like, wow, I'm part of a truly radical, trippy reality. And I sort of, me being this small, seemingly insignificant thing, I actually can serve a purpose in this by creating something that has never been created before, for example.
True and good and beautiful and practical. I'm curious how you think about it being instantiated at the level of individual internal practice. So imagine the aspiring yogi in a cave by themselves, but they're informed by this worldview. What is it that they can do with their attention, with their organism that would participate in this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for the yogi in particular, I don't think he necessarily has to do anything special other than, okay, so in this worldview, you have this complex system that's emerging at this global level. And the complexity, as I said, is a function of two things: integration of the parts and the diversity or variety of the parts. And this isn't my own definition. John Maynard Smith, the evolutionary biologist of the 20th century, he's a super smart guy, kind of came up with the idea of these evolutionary transitions, which were left out of the Darwinian story of evolution. Like there was just no concept of these transitions that are also called metasystem transitions. He, kind of gave us this understanding of how to define complexity, which has been like a really slippery concept. And so it's not perfect because you have all of these levels. So when you talk about this complexity being a function of diversity and integration, that system can be part of a larger system as well. So you have to think about these different scales. But when you think about, for example, life, like a single-celled organism, life wouldn't emerge in a world with just hydrogen and helium. You need this diversity of chemical elements to have life. You need carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, probably nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. You need like that spectrum of things, because what they allow is the division of labor. You can't get much complexity out of parts that are all the same or do the same thing. In a human organism, we have over 200 cell types. So we need all of these different cell types. We need neurons, we need white blood cells, we need red blood cells, we need osteocytes, bone cells. We need all of these things to make a functional whole. And when you go up a scale to like the biosphere, you have all of these species. I don't remember whether there's like billions or trillions of species. One time I was trying to get to the bottom of that answer, and Science, like Scientific American and some other big site would say like wildly different things, but it's this massive amount of species, and together it makes this functional biosphere that is a cybernetic self-regulating system that people have called Gaia. So the Gaia theory says that basically the biosphere keeps the Earth's temperature in a narrow range that's friendly for life, and it keeps the gas composition in a range that's friendly for complex life. So it's this story of diversity and connection. And so if that story applies to the global brain, which is human civilization, all of these human agents connected by our devices, exchanging information in much the same way that neurons exchange electrical signals in the brain, then you want a diversity of ideas. You want a diversity of different types of people doing different careers. If everybody was a engineer, even though engineering is like this thing that builds stuff, like society wouldn't be functional. You couldn't be all doctors, it couldn't be all artists. You need all of those things. So I think if you're contributing to the diversity of ideas, you're contributing to this emergence of this global consciousness. But the yogi, I wouldn't say if he's just goes in a cave and he meditates and he comes to all of these deep realizations through that deep contemplation and he dies and he doesn't tell anybody about what he learned, I think it's a complete waste. So the yogi's sort of responsibility and goal in all this is to come out of the cave and to maybe write a book that can show other people how to reach these higher states of consciousness. Or, it doesn't have to be some realization about nature that changes, your understanding of the world. It can maybe just bring inner peace. It can make people more relaxed. And then, but if the yogi dies, that knowledge doesn't go anywhere. It dies with him. If he puts out a book that sells 1 million copies, then perhaps existential anxiety is reduced for the global population, and maybe we avoid a nuclear war that wouldn't have been avoided if that yogi didn't share that knowledge. So we all need to just live our lives in a way that contributes to this diversity of ideas, and that's going to be different for different people. Like I said, you don't have to be a SpaceX engineer. You don't have to be someone who's, writes a book trying to explain this paradigm. Maybe your thing is cats. Maybe you just love cats and you want to create a website that is all about cute cats and spreads cat memes. If you do that to the best of your ability. Make the best damn cat website you can and bring happiness to people. And that can have this large scale effect. It can have if, I'm like here trying to spread these ideas. I'm like looking at my different like podcast interviews. I'm like, oh, that's nice. Like a few thousand views. And then there's like this cat video and it's like 5 million views. And I'm like, damn it. Like, are people interested in like these scientific ideas that help the world? But it's like, no, that cat video, like, people are signing on to Instagram and they're maybe pissed or like feeling depressed. And then they smile and then, then they say something nice to a stranger and that propagates. So this teleological stance, this idea that you can look at the universe as having this purpose and evolution being this progress, it doesn't mean process of progress. It doesn't mean you have to contribute directly to that. You can contribute to that in all sorts of different ways. But what I would say is like whatever you're doing, put as much meaning into it as you can. Try to create your masterpiece. So I would love to see people, because a lot of people get bummed out. Maybe they're like, I'm not really good at like anything. And when they say anything, they're thinking about the things, the way that society measures value. They may not be thinking about, whatever they're into. That's like some creative project that might not have like a monetary value. It might not be able to make you rich. But if you put everything into it and you put it out there, in most cases, other people are going to find meaning in it as well. So, it's up for every individual to find their own purpose. Michael Shermer gave a quote for the book, which was cool because he's known as like a skeptic and an atheist, but he was open to this view because it does have this mechanistic explanation for everything. But he says, what if our cosmic purpose is to create our own cosmic purpose? And I think that's sort of what it is. It's like we do have this larger role to play in everything, but it's not clear what that role is for each individual. We have to find it.
I love that Shermer quote is there because I think that really speaks well of the vision that you're putting forward. If it can get a guy like that to open to some kind of larger, more meaningful general perspective, then it's pretty powerful. There's clearly a lot more things we could talk about. I think it would take a long time for you and I to figure out how many parts we have to collaborate with each other, but I'm mindful of the time. It's been maybe over an hour and a half now. So I'm going to wind down with a final question. And it's around doom and feeling bad, because the story you're telling is very optimistic. It's a way that things can work out. And that's obviously where we should be putting our constructive energy. Whereas a lot of people have this sense of this apocalyptic feeling that hangs over the world at the moment.
Yeah.
Now, One way to go at that is to say, hey, change from that apocalyptic feeling over to this more constructive, optimistic story. And another thing is to say to them, well, you're going through a grieving process. You actually should go further into it. You should feel much worse in order to come out more naturally rather than in a forced manner. So, how do you think about people's negative feelings about the world? And should they just stop doing that, or should they do it more profoundly?
Yeah, haven't thought deeply about that, those two options, but that's really interesting. And I think it everybody's like on their own kind of journey. And some people might hear this, worldview and go, okay, that's cool. That's a good way to see things, and it seems to be based on science, so I'll go for that. Maybe other people are going to be skeptical and think that we're sort of doomed. But here's the effect of that: the people who might think we're doomed, compared to the people that think that progress is guaranteed, might work harder to solve the problems, because they're like, oh, we're completely fucked unless I do something about it. So people might have this question like, how can progress be inevitable? It seems like we can succeed or we can fail. But here's what happens. When we start to fail, or we start to see the rising division, and we start to see this meaning crisis, then suddenly there's a bunch of people that start going, oh shit, there's a meaning crisis. We need to do something about it. Like, we need to solve that problem. So again, it comes back to this principle of problems create progress. And I actually believe that to achieve this higher state of progress, we have to go through this chaotic period. We have to have a meaning crisis to come up with a solution to the meaning crisis. So, yeah, I think it's healthy for people to question this narrative, but whether you question it or not, basically, if you want to see, everybody has, or almost everybody has, family members or friends or people they love. So we're all invested in getting to this higher point, this phase transition towards like a higher state of order, rather than seeing it collapse. If it did collapse, then the people that exist after that collapse will go, like, they'll say, they'll be able to see where we went wrong and why the collapse happened and why we shouldn't repeat that mistake. So again, it has this tendency towards progress, no matter what happens. But we want to avert disaster if we can, and there's no reason that we have to go in the direction if we're aware of what's happening. So yeah, I think the thing that this paradigm does is it kind of aligns our interest, and by accepting it, we can go, okay, you're my neighbor, you're this highly religious guy, you go to church every Sunday, and you believe Jesus is your Lord and Savior. I don't believe that. I don't see anything really compelling about that, compared to the other religions, but you want to do better for society. And this paradigm basically says that there is this process of progress, which requires a lot of fine tuning for the laws of physics and constants for nature to be this way. So suddenly, whether you believe that this design that we see that gives rise to this process is something that can be explained through, a scientific theory, or like a simulation theory, maybe you think, okay, there's this design because we are the creation of an intelligent agent. Well, religious people believe that the universe has this tendency towards, progress and good, because it's the design of a creator God that cares about humanity. What the paradigm does is say there's no, like, that no longer is off the table. the universe does appear to have some sort of design, whether you think we are living in a simulation or whether it's a multiverse with every possible universe and we happen to live in one that looks designed. Like the sort of intellectual barriers that existed between a secular person and a religious person suddenly get dissolved by this theory. Suddenly the cosmos, and I was talking to Brendan the other day. I was actually showing him this book called The Intelligent Universe, and Ray Kurzweil, the director, Google's director of engineering, writes about how this process of life spreading is kind of life's destiny. And he talks about, he makes statements that the universe is clearly has a design. And he doesn't know why. There's cosmological natural selection theory that says there was this evolutionary process where universes birthed other universes with the creation of black holes. Basically, that creates like a big bang in like a new universe, and that this like fine tunes the parameters to lead to these kind of teleological universes that are like going towards this goal. But so with this new view, the nihilistic view is out the window. There is a design, and suddenly there's no like reason to see yourself as superior to someone with religious beliefs. So what that does is say, okay, you have a theory about the nature of reality that explains this in terms of a creator, but we both agree that there is this purpose and meaning infused in life that can basically, we can come to an agreement about like what's good or what we should do. Like we both agree that like life has meaning and purpose. And if the scientific worldview accepts that, then I see no reason for there to be any sort of like friction or conflict between the religious and the secular people of the world. So that's, why I think this paradigm can be like, it's not just a new way to look at like cosmic evolution and science. It could literally be the thing that bridges the different religions and the different secular ideologies. And yeah, if we see that, it's like an idealistic dream, but like if we align our interests under this worldview of like meaning and purpose, all the wars that were caused by religion and different ideologies, like all of those things, all of those ideas that are keeping us separated seem to dissolve because we can agree that there's meaning and purpose and that life is good and that we should be doing all we can to see that it flourishes. So yeah, kind of all over the place. I've had a lot of fun here because I don't really get to talk about this, kind of spiritual side of it. In most interviews, I'm just talking about the science. But to me, it's what really motivated me to write the book. When I was like halfway through, it was difficult. It was during the pandemic. I was stuck inside. I had never written anything over like, something like at the magnitude of like 100,000 words. And you talking about like whether this perspective is just like useful. I really believe that it is the way nature is, but it was this sort of idea that this idea could be important. It could sort of unify people with different ideologies and kind of bring us to the same general ideology, even if we disagreed about like the ultimate reason that nature is that way. And it made me, it instilled this sort of purpose in me that like, okay, I have to create this thing that articulates it. And it did kind of like radicalize me. It gave me like this totally different feeling where I'd wake up in the morning and I was like, this is important. This is like bigger than me to get this story out. Even if it doesn't convince anyone, maybe it will, help someone write the next book that actually like, amplifies this at the scale needed to do something. So yeah, I don't even remember the original question, but I appreciate you allowing me to kind of explore my own thoughts and feelings about like what this worldview can do and why it's important.
Yeah, this has been fun, man. And if we did another conversation, the place I would pick up would be problems. This sort of Karl Popper, Carl Friston idea, because I think there's a lot of overlap between the science and the inner psychotechnologies there, with discrepancy and friction and contradiction and paradox and problem are the basic anti-entropic driver across multiple evolving scales of reality. That shows up in a lot of practices, in koans and remorse, in making a container for inner friction in spiritual work and things like that. So there are a lot of ways I think there can be very direct conscious psychological engagement with the problem and the problem solving mechanism of our cognition that brings the information sciences together with a lot of classic spiritual practice. But
I'd love to
next,
explore that more, and I'd love to learn more about it, because one thing I did see, like with this story, it's the process of progress. Just I know we gotta go, but yeah, to quickly wrap up, the process of progress is this kind of like rationing thing where like there's problems that like force us to find solutions, or you can see it as this dynamic between order and disorder, or life and chaos, or life and entropy. And you see that theme throughout different religions in the world. You see it in the yin and yang of Taoism. You see it in the fight between good and evil in Christianity. You see it in the interdependent co-arising of Buddhism. So and you also see it in like the dialectic of Hegel. So I think religion has basically used like a process of like human inference, like intuition. We're like looking at nature and there's like this uncertainty and cognitive dissonance, and we're trying to resolve that. And so religion is kind of an accumulation of practical and philosophical knowledge that used a sort of primitive version of the scientific method. You have these beliefs, and then you sort of test them or you pass them around to other people, and those people decide what beliefs get sort of filtered out of history. So all of the major religious ideas that have survived this long have passed basically a natural selection filter. And I think they do have some practical utility. So what I want to do in the future, and something that I've, been working with people, for example, people who are like, I have a friend who is a complexity theorist, but he's also a devout Christian. I have a friend who's a yogi that meditates like 5 hours a day, and he wrote a book called The Infraboros, but he believes in this kind of recursive universe that has all of these same principles. So what I want to try to do is take this cosmic story of hierarchical self-organization that I've explained and map that on to the different concepts from different religions. And I think what we'll find is that the things, the concepts that the different religions have in common are universal truths that map onto reality. So that's pretty exciting to me, because it means that science isn't just like throwing religion out the window. There's a lot of knowledge there that is the product of deep human thought. And if we can start to synthesize this scientific view with all the knowledge from the different religions and cultures of the world, then I think, what I've proposed today is just a very incomplete view of a much, richer worldview that requires like, it has to be like augmented and the holes filled in by the knowledge of religion. So yeah, I'd like to explore that more.
right. Well, I'm a big supporter of your work. I'm happy you've been radicalized, and thanks for being with us, Bobby.
Thank you. I'm a big fan of your Substack as well. So I can't wait to continue this dialogue in the future.
Fantastic. Cheers, man.